In 1792, the United States Congress passed a law that would quietly shape the next 2 centuries of global finance. It was called the Coinage Act of 1792, and on the surface, it looked simple: a law to create a national mint, define the value of coins, and give a young republic its own money. But beneath the surface, this act was far more than a bureaucratic measure. It was the founding blueprint for American money, a system built on silver, gold, and trust, and the moment the U.S. decided how wealth itself would be defined. Yet over time, the core principles of this act were forgotten, twisted, or deliberately erased. What began as a promise of honest money turned into a machine of credit, inflation, and manipulation. Picture the scene. Philadelphia, 1792. The nation was barely a decade old. George Washington sat as the first president, and Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant, controversial Treasury Secretary, had a vision. He believed that for the United States to thrive, it needed not just independence in politics, but independence in money. At that time, America had no official currency. People used a chaotic mix of Spanish pesos, British pounds, Dutch guilders, and privately issued notes. Commerce was a mess. Prices changed from town to town. Trust in paper was low because the continental dollar, or used during the Revolution, had already collapsed. "Not worth a continental" was a phrase that literally came from that disaster. So Hamilton proposed a fix, a national system based on real metal, gold, and silver. The Coinage Act of 1792 established a U.S. mint and declared that the dollar would be the unit of account. But what's fascinating is how it defined that dollar. It wasn't just a name. It was a precise weight of silver, 371.285 grains, or about 24 g of pure silver. The law also defined the value of gold coins, fixing the ratio between gold and silver at 15:1. In other words, one gold dollar was worth 15 silver dollars. This biometallic system was intended to balance the economy between scarcity and flexibility. Gold would stabilize value, while silver ensured everyday liquidity for ordinary citizens. And here's where it gets interesting. The act went further than most people realize. It made counterfeiting or debasing the money supply punishable by death. That's right. In 1792, if you knowingly manipulated the money, you could be executed. That one clause tells you how seriously the founders viewed monetary honesty. To them, debasing the currency wasn't a technical issue. It was moral theft, stealing from every person who held the dollar. Hamilton's design for the mint was meticulous. The act called for specific officers, a director and a sere, a chief coiner, and an engraver, all sworn to uphold the purity of the metals. It even detailed how coins should look: one side with the word liberty and an image symbolizing freedom, the other side with an eagle, the emblem of the new republic. Every coin was supposed to remind citizens that money in America came from law, labor, and liberty, not from kings or private bankers. But while the act gave America its monetary foundation, it also planted a time bomb. The fixed gold-silver ratio of 15:1 looked reasonable in 1792, but the real market ratio fluctuated. By the early 1800s, gold became undervalued in U.S. law, and silver coins began disappearing overseas. People naturally hoarded or exported the undervalued metal. An early example of Gresham's law: bad money drives out good. The very mechanism designed to ensure stability ended up creating shortages. Still, the symbolic power of the Coinage Act was immense. It marked the beginning of a uniquely American idea that money should serve the people, not the other way around. It was the law that gave birth to the word dollar as we know it. It defined value, not in arbitrary paper, but in measurable reality. Metal that could be held, tested, and trusted. And for decades, That system worked remarkably well. The dollar gained a reputation as one of the most honest currencies in the world. But as the country grew richer and more complex, that founding ideal started to erode. Wars, debts, and expansion made paper money tempting again. The Civil War would eventually force the government to issue unbacked greenbacks. Later, the Gold Standard Act of 1900 would simplify the system to gold only, abandoning silver. Then, in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt banned Americans from owning gold altogether. And finally, in 1971, Richard Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold. By that point, the coinage's original definition of money, honest, metallic, and finite, had been completely dismantled. What's left today is a system Hamilton would barely recognize. The modern dollar is just a promise, an IOU backed not by metal, but by faith in government and the Federal Reserve. It's a currency that can be created with a few keystrokes, a far cry from the carefully weighted coins of 1792. The death penalty for debasement has long been replaced by policies that openly celebrated under the banner of monetary stimulus. And yet, if you look closely, echoes of that old system remain. The U.S. Mint still exists. Coins still bear the word liberty, but their metal value is symbolic, not intrinsic. A modern dime or quarter isn't worth even a fraction of its face value in metal. Inflation, once seen as moral corruption, is now considered healthy. In many ways, the Coinage Act of 1792 serves as both a monument and a warning. It reminds us that America's founders understood something that modern policymakers often ignore. Money is trust, and once the trust is broken, it cannot easily be repaired. But what if we were to measure the modern dollar against the original definition? A dollar defined as 24 grams of silver would today be worth around 20 to 25 real-world dollars, depending on silver prices. In other words, the currency has lost over 95% of its purchasing power since the founding era. Every inflation chart you've seen, every rise in prices, every shrinking paycheck is at its core the story of that loss of trust. The Coinage Act of 1792 was not just about minting coins. It was a declaration of economic sovereignty, an attempt to ensure that no king, banker, or bureaucrat could manipulate the lifeblood of commerce. It was the monetary equivalent of the Constitution, a framework to protect citizens from invisible theft. Today, as the U.S. faces mounting debt, runaway deficits, and an inflationary spiral, revisiting that forgotten law might not just be a history lesson. It might be a roadmap to rediscover what sound money truly means. As the 19th century unfolded, the American monetary system, born from the Coinage Act of 1792, began to face challenges its creators could never have anticipated. The U.S. was expanding westward. New states were joining the Union, and industrialization was reshaping how people worked, traded, and saved. Yet, beneath the surface of progress, the foundation of the money system, gold and silver, was being quietly tested. Every boom, every panic, and every bank run exposed the fragile balance between paper promises and metal reality. In 1834, the first major crack appeared. Congress changed the gold to silver ratio from 151 to roughly 161. On paper, it was a small adjustment meant to bring U.S. currency in line with global markets. In practice, it had enormous consequences. Overnight, gold became more valuable relative to silver. Silver coins began to vanish from circulation, melted down or shipped overseas, while gold took their place. The U.S. effectively slipped from a biometallic standard to a de facto gold standard decades before it was official. What had been designed as a system of balance now leaned toward the interests of bankers and merchants who preferred gold exportability and prestige over silver Q accessibility. By the 1850s, the contradictions in the system grew even clearer. The discovery of gold in California flooded markets with new supply, increasing inflation. The U.S. Mint churned out new gold coins, but the fixed legal ratios meant silver still didn't return to circulation. The result was a strange hybrid system, technically biometallic, but functionally not. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the illusion of monetary stability collapsed entirely. The government, desperate to finance its armies, issued paper money, the infamous greenbacks. For the first time since 1792, American money was not backed by metal. The founding principle of honest money was suspended in the name of survival. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Inflation soared. Prices doubled in some cities. Soldiers were paid in paper that lost value before they could spend it. Ordinary citizens watched their savings evaporate. And yet, Wall Street speculators, those with access to gold or government contracts, grew richer. The divide between money owners and money users widened. The very moral line that the Coinage Act had tried to draw, protecting citizens from monetary corruption, was crossed. After the war, the U.S. faced a dilemma. Should it return to the gold and silver standards of the past, or embrace the new flexibility of paper credit? The debate became ferocious. Farmers and laborers wanted soft money, more greenbacks to make credit easier and debts lighter. Bankers, creditors, and industrialists demanded a return to gold, hard money to protect their wealth from inflation. It wasn't just an economic argument. It was a moral one, echoing the old Hamiltonian ideal that honest money was sacred. In 1873, Congress made a fateful decision, one that would later be known as the Crime of '73. Without much public debate, it quietly demonetized silver. The dollar was now officially tied only to gold. The law effectively ended the bimetallic dream that had begun in 1792. Overnight, millions of silver coins were rendered useless for currency. Prices of agricultural goods fell. Farmers were crushed under the weight of debts that became harder to pay back. A dollar defined by scarce gold meant that credit was tight and deflation ruled. The Coinage Act of 1792, which once aimed to serve the common citizen, had evolved into a tool serving those who controlled gold and, by extension, power. This shift didn't go unnoticed. The late 19th century became an era of intense populist anger over money. Movements like the Greenback Party and the civil rights emerged, demanding a return to Baitalism. Their slogan was simple: free silver. The famous Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan in 1896 captured the rage perfectly. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryan's words were a direct challenge to the system that had abandoned the people's metal silver for the bankers' metal gold. It was a moral echo of 1792, a cry for a return to monetary justice. But the gold standard held firm. By 1900, the U.S. officially confirmed gold as the sole basis for its money. The Coinage Act's original vision of a balanced system, where both metals supported the economy, was dead. Money they used. Reserve. The irony is painful. Now control shifted upward to banks, the Treasury, and eventually the Federal Reserve. The irony is painful. The founders created the Coinage Act to prevent financial manipulation. Yet by the 20th century, the very structure of money had become the most powerful form of manipulation. The ability to expand or contract credit, to peg or unpeg gold, to issue or withhold currency, all became tools of political and financial strategy. What began as a moral contract between government and citizen had turned into a game of leverage between institutions. Still, the symbols of 1792 lingered. Coins still bore the phrase, "In God we trust," Batman, added during the Civil War, to signal faith during chaos. But that phrase, once about moral conviction, slowly became a paradox. Trust had been replaced by compulsion. You didn't hold a dollar because you trusted it would keep its value. You held it because you were required to. The law declared it legal tender, and that was enough. By the time the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the transformation was complete. Money was no longer a fixed measure of value. It was a tool of policy, adjustable, expandable, and political. The Fed could create reserves with a pen stroke. Banks could lend 10 times their deposits. Credit replaced coinage as the true engine of the economy. The ideals of the Coinage Act, that money should be stable, measurable, and moral, were buried under the weight of modern finance. Yet, the historical irony is this. Every modern debate about inflation, debt, and the dollar's decline traces back to that original act. The founders knew that honest money was the backbone of liberty. They understood that when you allow money to lose value, you erode the foundation of trust between citizens and their government. In a sense, the Coinage Act of 1792 was America's first firewall against tyranny, because whoever controls money controls freedom. Today, when the Federal Reserve prints trillions or inflation quietly robs savings, it's not just an economic event. It's a betrayal of the founding principle. The death penalty for debasement may be gone, but the crime itself continues in slow motion through policy instead of forgery. If Hamilton and Washington could see the modern system, fiat currency, endless debt, and speculative finance, they would recognize the same danger they tried to outlaw. Money has been transformed from a tool of fairness into a tool of control. And that perhaps is the greatest forgotten truth of all. The Coinage Act wasn't just a law about coins. It was a declaration about power, who should hold it, and who should be protected from it. By the early 20th century, America's relationship with money had changed so completely that the spirit of the 1792 Coinage Act seemed like a relic of a lost civilization. What had once been a tangible promise, a dollar measured in metal, was now a floating abstraction backed by confidence alone. The government and banking system had become the architects of that confidence, but it was a fragile architecture built on faith in the very institutions that had rewritten the rules. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, was the ultimate symbol of that transformation. A central authority empowered to control credit, interest rates, and the money supply itself. In theory, it was designed to stabilize the economy. In practice, it gave a small group of unelected officials the power that the founders had once sworn no man should hold, the power to define the value of everyone's labor, savings, and wealth. The Great Depression would put the power to the test. When the stock market crashed in 1929, deflation swept across the country. Banks failed, savings vanished, and the gold standard, once a symbol of trust, became a straitjacket. People hoarded gold because it was the only form of money they trusted. But that created a paradox. The more people clung to gold, the less the system could function. The government needed spending and liquidity, but all the real money was being hidden under mattresses. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a shocking move. He ordered all citizens to turn in their gold coins and certificates to the government in exchange for paper dollars. Private ownership of gold was now illegal. The very metal that the founders had used to anchor freedom was now contraband. The Coinage Act of 1792 had declared death the punishment for debasing money. In 1933, the government had done something even more audacious, and it redefined what money was. Gold coins that had circulated for over a century were withdrawn. The dollar's link to gold was severed domestically, and the official price of gold was raised from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, or effectively devaluing the dollar overnight. The average citizen's savings were instantly worth less, while the government's gold reserves were worth more. It was in effect a transfer of wealth from the people to the state, all executed through a quiet redefinition of money self. This marked a profound moral shift. The founders had believed that sound money was essential to protect the public from government abuse. Roosevelt's move, though perhaps necessary in crisis, set a precedent. The government could now change the rules of money whenever it deemed fit. It could compel surrender, adjust value, and redefine fairness. The old logic of the Coinage Act, that money should be beyond manipulation, was officially dead. But the transformation didn't stop there. After World War II, the United States emerged as the new global financial leader. The 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement cemented the dollar's dominance by tying it to gold and making other currencies dependent on it. On paper, the U.S. dollar was as good as gold. In reality, it was backed by the political and economic might of the United States. The dollar had replaced gold as the foundation of global trust. Yet beneath this confidence lay the same contradiction that haunted every paper system. The supply of promises was growing faster than the supply of gold to back them. Through the 1950s and 1960s, America printed more dollars to finance its military ambitions and welfare programs, while foreign governments accumulated those dollars and began demanding gold in return. By the late 1960s, the U.S. was bleeding gold reserves. The French famously sent a warship to New York to retrieve its gold holdings, a dramatic symbol of waning trust in the dollar's promise. The U.S. faced a dilemma eerily reminiscent of the old biometallic crisis. Too many claims on too little metal. Then came 1971, the year that buried the last remnant of the Coinage Act's vision. President Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. It was supposed to be a short-term emergency measure. Instead, it became permanent. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, money backed by nothing but trust and government decree. With a single announcement, nearly 180 years of American monetary tradition were erased. From that moment forward, money was no longer a store of value. It was a tool of policy. The Federal Reserve could create it at will. Governments could spend without moral restraint, and banks could lend exponentially more than they held. The foundation of the Coinage Act, that a dollar was defined by weight, purity, and honesty, had been inverted. Now, money was defined by the needs of the state, not the rights of the citizen. And yet, the illusion of stability persisted. People continued to work, save, and invest, believing the dollar would always retain its worth. Inflation was gradual enough that most didn't notice how their purchasing power eroded year after year. But over the decades, the compounding effect of this silent theft became undeniable. The dollar of 1792, a hard, measurable promise, had become a soft, shifting idea. A worker in 2025 must earn dozens of paper dollars to match the buying power of a single 1792's worth of silver. The promise of sound money had not just been broken, it had been forgotten. Still, the ghost of 1792 lingers in subtle ways. The mint still produces coins, though they're largely symbolic. The dollar still claims continuity with its past, though the connection is spiritual at best. And the debate over what money should be, whether hard, digital, decentralized, or controlled, still echoes the old battles between Hamilton and Jefferson. The founders would recognize the same fundamental tension, the eternal struggle between those who want money to serve the people and those who want it to serve power. Today's debates about central bank digital currencies, inflation targeting, and fiscal stimulus are just modern expressions of that ancient question. Every new financial innovation, from quantitative easing to cryptocurrency, forces us to revisit the principles first laid down in 1792. Is money a tool of the state or a measure of freedom? Should it be manipulable or immutable, fair or strategic? The answers perhaps will define the next century as clearly as the Coinage Act defined the first. Because in the end, all economic systems, whether they use gold, paper, or code, rise and fall on trust. And once that trust breaks, The collapse is never just financial. It's moral. The legacy of the Coinage Act of 1792 is more than a story of old coins and forgotten laws. It is a story about the soul of money itself. At its heart, the act represented a contract, a promise that what you earned, saved, and exchanged had real meaning, defined by something beyond politics or power. Every later change to that foundation, from paper notes to fiat currency to digital money, has tested how far society can stretch that promise before it snaps. When you look back at the debates that shaped the Coinage Act, you see something profound. America's founders feared inflation more than taxation. They saw the debasement of money as a form of theft, subtle, silent, and devastating. Inflation was not merely an economic phenomenon. It was a moral one. It punished prudence and rewarded excess. It eroded savings, destabilized contracts, and shifted wealth from workers to debtors, from citizens to governments. The founders knew that when money loses meaning, trust collapses soon after. For more than a century, that principle guided the U.S. economy. The gold and silver standard didn't just stabilize trade, it restrained power. Politicians could not spend recklessly because they couldn't print gold. Banks couldn't inflate credit beyond their reserves. Savers knew their money would hold its worth. There was balance, and with it, accountability. But the 20th century replaced that accountability with flexibility. The kind of flexibility that always benefits those closest to the source of money creation. When the Federal Reserve expands its balance sheet, when governments run trillion-dollar deficits, or when commercial banks multiply credit through leverage, the first recipients of new money gain the most. Prices haven't yet adjusted, assets haven't yet inflated, and the real economy hasn't yet absorbed the shock. By the time that money trickles down to workers and savers, inflation has already eaten into their purchasing power. This dynamic, known as the Cantillon effect, is the modern version of coin debasement. In 1792, corruptors could shave a coin's edge to pocket silver dust. In 2025, policymakers can expand the money supply and call it stimulus. The tools are more sophisticated, but the outcome is the same. Wealth moves upward and the value of savings falls. The victims don't even realize it's happening because it's hidden behind charts, jargon, and promises of stability. Now, we live in a world where money exists mostly as numbers on screens. Only a tiny fraction of the global money supply is physical. The rest is credit, data, and code. This digitization has made transactions faster, but it's also made control easier. Governments can freeze accounts, monitor flows, and create or destroy liquidity at will. Central banks are developing digital currencies that could, in theory, replace cash entirely. If that happens, money will no longer just represent value. It will represent permission. In such a system, every transaction could be monitored, approved, or denied. Spending limits could be programmed. Expiration dates could be set. Dissent could be punished financially without ever passing a law. And the oldest idea in economic liberty, that your money is your property, could vanish with a software update. This is why the forgotten lessons of the Coinage Act still matter. They remind us that money is not neutral. It shapes behavior, incentives, and power structures. When individuals control money, they are free. When institutions control money, individuals serve those institutions. The form of money determines the form of society. You can see this tension playing out across the world today. Nations that once mocked gold as obsolete are quietly buying tons of it. Central banks are diversifying away from dollars. Cryptocurrencies, though volatile, represent a grassroots demand for monetary independence. And ordinary people squeezed by inflation are asking fundamental questions. What gives money its value? Who benefits from its creation? And how much of my labor is real if the value of what I earn melts away every year? The truth is that monetary systems rarely collapse because people lose faith in numbers. They collapse because people lose faith in fairness. The 1792 system failed not because gold and silver were wrong, but because governments found them inconvenient. The fiat system that replaced it will fail for the same reason. Not because paper or digital money can't work, but because they invite abuse. Power, once unrestrained, always expands until it breaks the system that sustains it. That is the real warning hidden in the Coinage Act. It wasn't just about coins or currency definitions. It was a warning against hubris, against the belief that governments could redefine value without consequence. Every empire that has tried has learned the same lesson. Rome diluted its silver. France printed its segments. Why Germany ran its presses. Each believed it could control outcomes with clever policy. Each collapsed when trust evaporated. So what does that mean for us today? It means the story isn't over. The next chapter of money is being written right now in the policies of central banks, in the architecture of digital currencies, and in the decisions of people like you. Whether you save, invest, or opt out of the system entirely. The principles of 1792 still whisper across the centuries. Money must be real, measurable, and honest. Otherwise, it will become a weapon. When the founders wrote the Coinage Act, they probably didn't imagine a world of algorithms and high-frequency trading. But they would understand the aches. They knew that once money serves politics instead of the people, collapse is inevitable. It may take decades. It may disguise itself as progress, but the end is always the same. Wealth concentrates, trust erodes, and value disappears. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. The failure of modern money won't come from technology or economics. It will come from forgetting what the founders already knew.